3,000 men will die. An admiral will bleed on the deck of his own flagship, hit twice by American bullets, and ask a question that no one on that bridge will be able to answer. What kind of airplanes are those? They will be the airplanes that officially do not exist. Because on that same morning, 10,000 miles away, in a quiet office at Wright Field in Ohio, a United States Army Air Force engineer will be holding a rubber stamp over a set of pencils drawings signed by the man now sitting in a hangar in Brisbane. The stamp will read, "Impractical." The engineer will press it down. By the time the stamp lands on the paper, the airplanes it declares impossible will already be in the air. This is the story of how a man with no engineering degree, working under a photograph of the family he had lost, built the weapon that his own government said could not exist, and then flew it into the largest one-day naval slaughter of the Pacific War. This is the story of Pappy Gunn, and this is the story of the man on the other side of the ocean. The man he never met, the man he killed anyway. Paul Irvin Gunn was born on October 18th, 1899, in a town called Quitman, Arkansas, the kind of town where the blacksmith was your father and the road out was your only future. His father Nathaniel made horseshoes. Paul wanted to make airplanes. He enlisted in the United States Navy in the closing weeks of the First World War. The Navy trained him as an aviation mechanist mate, an enlisted man, not an officer. He learned engines the way other men learned prayer, with his hands, in the dark, by touch and by repetition. He served 21 years. When he retired in 1939, he had never been to college. He had never taken a formal engineering course, but he had by then learned to fly. He married Clara Louise Crosby on the 7th of June, 1921. Everyone called her Polly. Together, they had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. Paul Jr., Nathaniel, the youngest, whom the family called Nat, Julie, and Connie. By 1939, Paul was living in Manila. He had founded a small airline called Philippine Airlines, 5 Beechcraft aircraft, 24 employees. On the morning of December 8, 1941, 7th in Hawaii, the Japanese bombed Clark Field, and Paul Gunn watched his adopted country begin to burn. He got his American employees out. He flew them to Australia in one of his own airplanes. He did not get his family out. Polly and Paul Jr. and Nat and Julie and little Connie, all 5 of them were rounded up by the Imperial Japanese Army in January of 1942 and marched into an internment camp at Santo Tomas University in central Manila. Paul Gunn was in Australia when he received the news. He was 2,000 miles away. He did not sleep that night. He did not sleep for many nights. The United States Army Air Force did not particularly care about credentials in the spring of 1942. It cared about men who could fix airplanes. In February, they made Paul Gunn a captain. He was 42 years old. He had, by any honest measure of the word, nothing left to lose. He asked for combat assignment. They gave him Eagle Farm. Eagle Farm Airfield sat on the northeastern edge of Brisbane. It was a maintenance depot. Wrecked airplanes came in on flatbed trucks and rebuilt ones flew out. And in the summer of 1942, the wrecks were arriving faster than they were leaving. The problem was the Japanese. The Imperial Japanese Navy was reinforcing New Guinea by sea. Fast transports, well-escorted convoys. The 5th Air Force was trying to stop them with high-altitude bombing. B-17s and B-25s dropping ordnance from 15,000 feet against ships that were moving 20 knots across an open ocean. In July of 1942, the 3rd Attack Group lost 11 A-20 Havoc bombers trying to hit Japanese shipping. Not one confirmed sinking. Bombs from high altitude could not hit a moving ship. Bombers that came in low were shredded by anti-aircraft fire before they could line up an attack. There was, as far as the Army Air Force was concerned, no solution. Captain Paul Gunn disagreed. The idea he sketched out, in pencil, on the back of a maintenance report, sitting on the tail of a wrecked A-20 in the summer heat of Queensland, was simple enough to be dismissed and radical enough to change a war. Take a light bomber, rip out the bombardier's compartment in the nose. Weld 450 caliber machine guns into the empty space. Fire them forward. Fire them all at once. Kill the anti-aircraft gunners on the deck of the enemy ship before they can lower their barrels. Then drop bombs from 50 feet, so low that the bombs skip across the water like stones and hit the ship's hull below the waterline. He needed guns. The Army did not have guns to spare. So Paul Gunn walked out to the boneyard behind Eagle Farm, the fenced lot where wrecked P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks were rusting in the Australian sun, and he began unbolting the 50 calibers from the noses of dead fighters. He carried the guns back to his workshop one at a time. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. He was 42 years old, working alone, in a hangar with no engineers, no wind tunnel, no supervision, and no permission. On April 28, 1942, a U.S. Army captain named Frederick Hoffman walked into that hangar. Hoffman had known Paul Gunn before the war, back in the Philippines. He was overseeing aircraft assembly in Australia. He had heard rumors that a certain former Navy chief was doing unauthorized modifications on Army airplanes, and he had come to investigate. He found Paul Gunn under the nose of a Douglas A-20 with a welding mask pushed up on his forehead. Hoffman did not report him. Hoffman introduced him to a man named Jack Fox. Jack Fox was in his mid-30s. He was a field service representative for North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25 Mitchell bomber. He was the senior technical liaison for every American medium bomber in the South Pacific. He had a degree, he had blueprints, he had authority. He was exactly the man who was supposed to stop Paul Gunn. Instead, Jack Fox looked at Pappy's welded-in 50 calibers, looked at the pencil sketches, looked at the recoil calculations that Pappy had done in his head, and did something that no one at North American Aviation had authorized him to do. By June of 1942, 9 months before the Bismarck Sea, Jack Fox had gathered every drawing Pappy Gunn had ever scratched onto the back of a maintenance report, and he had shipped them back to the North American factory in Long Beach, California, with his own signature on the cover page. He did not have permission. He did not ask. In August of 1942, Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Australia to take command of the 5th Air Force. Kenney was 53 years old, small, sharp, chain-smoking, and possessed of the particular kind of ruthlessness that produces both great generals and difficult subordinates. He had been sent to the Pacific to fix a broken air war. He had been given 90 days to do it. Within his first week in country, someone told him about the old Navy chief at Eagle Farm who was welding machine guns onto Army airplanes without authorization. Kenney flew to Charters Towers. He watched a modified A-20 fly. He watched Pappy Gunn land it, climb out, and light a cigarette, with hands that were still shaking from the recoil. Kenney did not court-martial him. Kenney made him a member of his personal staff. By September 12th of 1942, 16 of Pappy Gunn's modified A-20 Havocs, nose guns welded in by hand, ammunition boxes bolted to whatever surface would hold them, center of gravity corrected by moving radio equipment aft, hit the Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea, at treetop height. They destroyed 14 Japanese aircraft on the ground. They lost 0 of their own. Kenney flew to Brisbane the next morning. He walked into Pappy Gunn's hangar. He looked at the man with the welding torch and the pencil sketches and the photograph of his family in Manila. Then he said the sentence that would kill Rear Admiral Kimura. "Pappy, I need you to do the same thing to a B-25. The B-25 Mitchell was a bigger airplane, longer range, heavier payload, more room in the nose, more weight to balance, more recoil to absorb. The engineers at North American Aviation, the ones who had actually designed the airplane, had spent 3 years calculating exactly how much stress its aluminum skin could tolerate. They had numbers, they had wind tunnel data, they had a factory in Long Beach turning out one bomber every 4 hours. They had, in short, done everything the right way. And a man in Brisbane with no engineering degree was about to tell them they were wrong. 9,000 miles away, in an office at Wright Field, Ohio, a group of United States Army Air Force engineers were about to receive a set of blueprints, hand-drawn in pencil, submitted by a Navy mechanic who had never taken a stress calculation course in his life. They would study the drawings for 3 days. Then they would issue an official finding. The finding would use one word: impossible. The first B-25 Mitchell that Paul Gunn put his hands on nearly killed the pilot who flew it. It was December of 1942. The airplane sat on the concrete apron at Charters Towers in the dry heat of the Queensland outback, and to look at it, you would have said someone had already tried to wreck it and given up halfway through. The plexiglass nose was gone. In its place sat a welded steel frame holding 4 Browning M2 machine guns, each of them pointed straight forward like the barrels of a firing squad. 2 more guns were mounted in blister pods on the port side of the fuselage, 2 more on the starboard, 2 more in the top turret, locked in the forward position, so the turret gunner could fire past the pilot's head. 10 guns. Then Pappy added 2 more on each side, 14 guns total, all firing forward, 215 pounds of lead per second. The airplane weighed 640 pounds more in the nose than the factory had ever intended. When the first test pilot pulled back on the yoke to take off, the B-25 wanted to nose over on the runway. When it finally clawed itself into the air, it flew the way a wounded animal walks, leaning, angry, refusing to trim out. The pilot landed shaking. He told Pappy the airplane wanted to kill him. Pappy said he'd fix it. He moved the radio equipment aft. He shifted the batteries into the tail. He recalibrated the elevator trim by hand, turning the wheel 4 full degrees past factory specification, which was not something you were supposed to be able to do. He tested it. He crashed a landing. He tested it again. By the second week of December, the B-25 flew. Not well, not gently, but it flew. And when Pappy tripped the trigger on the yoke for the first time, and all 14 forward guns opened up in a single, sustained burst, the entire airplane shuddered from nose to tail like a man being electrocuted. The muzzle blast blew flakes of aluminum paint off the fuselage. Empty brass casings rained onto the tarmac by the hundreds. The noise carried across the airfield for a mile. The ground crew watched the airplane land. One of them, a young mechanic from Kansas whose name has been lost to history, said the sentence that stuck. "That's not a bomber, that's a destroyer with wings." The name they gave it, unofficially, was Pappy's Folly. The name that eventually stuck, officially, was Commerce Destroyer. By the middle of January 1943, Kenny had ordered every available B-25 in the theater to be modified the same way. The 81st Air Depot Group in Townsville worked 18-hour shifts. By late February, they had 30 of them. That was when the messages came back from Ohio. The engineers at Wright Field were not incompetent men. They were, in fact, some of the best structural analysts the United States could put in one building. Their job was to take airplanes that pilots had modified in the field and figure out whether those modifications would kill the crews who flew them. They studied Pappy Gunn's drawings for 3 days. The drawings were in pencil. There were no stress calculations. There were no vibration analyses. The engineers ran their own numbers. They calculated the recoil force of 14 simultaneous 50 caliber discharges. They calculated the fatigue on the aluminum skin around the cheek gun blisters. They calculated the shift in center of gravity, the change in aerodynamic drag, the load on the tail structure during high-speed maneuvering. The numbers came out bad. The muzzle blast alone, they determined, would peel the aluminum skin around the cheek gun mounts within 100 rounds. The recoil would fatigue the nose structure to failure within 20 combat missions. The center of gravity was so far forward that the airplane would be uncontrollable in any evasive maneuver above 240 knots. On March 1st, 1943, the engineers at Wright Field issued their finding. The finding was one word: impractical. The recommendation was to ground every modified B-25 in the 5th Air Force immediately, pending factory redesign. The message went out on the teletype. It landed in Washington on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, the commander of the entire United States Army Air Force. General George Kenney was in Washington that week. He was in Arnold's outer office when the message came in. He read it standing up. He folded the paper. He put it in his breast pocket. He did not say a word to the engineers, who were waiting to explain the finding to him. What Kenney knew, and what the engineers at Wright Field did not know, was that 10,000 miles away, across the international dateline, the airplanes they had just declared impossible were already in the air. They were already halfway to the Bismarck Sea. The engineers were about to be wrong in the most public way American engineers had ever been wrong. The Japanese called it Operation 81. The order had come down from the 8th Fleet headquarters at Rabaul in the last week of February 1943. 6,000 infantrymen of the 51st Division, men who had been fighting in China 2 years earlier, who had survived Guadalcanal, who represented the last strategic reserve the Empire could send to New Guinea, were to be moved from Rabaul to Lae on the north coast of New Guinea. 400 Marines from the Special Naval Landing Force would go with them. 8 transport ships would carry the men. 8 destroyers would escort them. The convoy would sail on the last day of February. It would arrive at Lae on the morning of March 4th. Once the troops were ashore, the Japanese counter-offensive at WWII could, if it succeeded, Port Moresby would fall by June. If Port Moresby fell, Australia itself would be within bomber range. The planners at Rabaul understood the risk. They had lost Guadalcanal in February. They knew Allied air power had grown across the Solomons and New Guinea. They calculated the acceptable loss rate before they signed the order: 50%. Half the ships were expected to be sunk before they reached Lae. Half the men, 3,000 infantrymen, were mathematically written off before the transports had even left the harbor at Rabaul. Their families in Sendai and Kochi and Sapporo would receive their death notices in the ordinary rotation of the mails. The Empire had already accepted it. The man they gave the mission to was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. Kimura was 51 years old. He had been born in Shizuoka Prefecture in December of 1891, adopted at birth by a family in Tottori Prefecture, and raised in a country that still remembered samurai as living men rather than statues. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in the class of 1913, the 41st class since the Academy's founding. He had graduated 107th out of 118 cadets. He was not the star of his class. He was not the star of anything. He had spent 30 years in the Imperial Navy, grinding his way up through destroyer commands. Small ships, difficult waters, routine assignments, while his more brilliant classmates commanded cruisers and taught at the War College. In November of 1942, at the age of 50, Kimura had finally been promoted to Rear Admiral. 3 months later, they gave him Destroyer Squadron 3 and told him to take 6,000 men to Leh. He knew the arithmetic. He knew what 50% meant. He gave the order to sail anyway. At midnight on the night of February 28, 1943, the 8 transports of Operation 81 slipped out of Simpson Harbor at Rabaul and formed up behind the destroyers. The transports were named Teiyo Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Taiyo Maru, Shinai Maru, Kembu Maru, and Nojima. They rode low in the water, packed with men and rifles and ammunition and the small, careful bundles of possessions that soldiers carry when they do not expect to come home. The 8 destroyers ringed them like a fence. The flagship was Shirayuki. Her name meant white snow. Her captain was Lieutenant Commander Rokuro Sugawara. She was a Fubuki-class destroyer, one of the most powerful destroyer designs the Imperial Navy had ever built. On her bridge stood Rear Admiral Kimura. He did not speak much during the transit out of Rabaul. He watched the coast of New Britain slide past in the moonless dark. He drank tea. He read the weather reports. The weather reports said the monsoon was thickening. Low clouds, poor visibility. The weather at least was on his side. He would need it. 2 other men on that convoy carried weight. On the destroyer Tokitsukaze rode Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, 52 years old, commander of the entire Japanese 18th Army in New Guinea. On the destroyer Yukikaze rode Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commander of the 51st Division itself, the man whose 6,000 infantrymen were riding in the transports. 3 general officers, 6,000 men, 8 transports, 8 destroyers. The largest reinforcement operation the Japanese army had attempted in the Southwest Pacific in 6 months. The Allies had been reading Japanese naval codes for months. The code breakers at Melbourne, the section called Frumel, knew a convoy was coming. They did not know when it would sail or exactly where it would go. But they were waiting. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon of March 1st, 1943, Lieutenant Walter Higgins of the 321st Bomb Squadron, piloting a B-24 Liberator on armed reconnaissance out of Port Moresby, caught sight of the convoy through a break in the overcast. He counted the ships. He counted them twice. He radioed Port Moresby. Kimura was on the bridge of Shirayuki when his lookouts spotted the B-24 turning east and climbing away. He knew what it meant. He gave no order to break formation. There was no point. The convoy was 5 days from Leh and there was no other route. He simply increased speed by 2 knots and continued south. 20 hours later, at 9:50 hours on the morning of March 2nd, the first Allied strike arrived. They were B-17 Flying Fortresses, high-altitude 4-engine bombers, flying at 15,000 feet, dropping 500-pound bombs through gaps in the cloud cover. They dropped 137 bombs. They sank exactly 1 ship, the transport Kyokusei Maru. The other 7 transports kept moving. On the bridge of Shirayuki, Rear Admiral Kimura permitted himself a very small breath of relief. High-altitude bombing did not work against moving ships. Everyone in the Imperial Navy knew this. The Americans had just proven it again. His fleet had absorbed exactly the level of loss that his planners had war-gamed. 1 ship out of 16, 6%. Well within tolerance. He ordered 2 of his destroyers to break away long enough to pick up the survivors from Kyokusei Maru. A humane order, an order any admiral would have given. Then he reformed the convoy and continued south into the Vitiaz Strait. He would reach dawn on March 3rd, holding formation, holding faith in the weather, holding on to a plan that had already been rendered obsolete by 12 airplanes he could not have imagined. 900 miles to the south, at Port Moresby, in a briefing tent that smelled of canvas and rain, Major Edward Larner of the 90th Bomb Squadron was reading his mission orders for the morning of March 3rd. He was 25 years old. He had 5.5 hours to sleep before takeoff. At 0630 hours on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, the largest coordinated airstrike of the Southwest Pacific Campaign lifted off from 6 separate airfields around Port Moresby and assembled above Cape Ward Hunt. 137 aircraft, 13 B-17 Flying Fortresses to draw fire from altitude, 13 A-20 Havocs, modified by Pappy Gunn's earlier design to strafe the destroyers, 13 Bristol Beaufighters from number 30 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force. Coming in first at the waves, flying so low the pilots later reported salt spray on their windshields, to force the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to depress their barrels, and 12 B-25 Mitchell Commerce destroyers, led by Major Ed Larner, flying at 50 feet above the ocean, each one carrying 14 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns and 1,000 pounds of skip bombs. Skip bombing itself was not Pappy Gunn's invention. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bomb Group had pioneered the technique with B-17s in October of 1942. Ben was already dead by March, killed in a crash in January, and by the winter of 1942, pilots throughout the 5th Air Force were practicing his technique against wrecked freighters in Australian bays. But it had never been done at this scale. It had never been done with 14 forward guns. It had never been done by 12 airplanes coming in line abreast against an entire convoy. At 10 hours, the strike force found the convoy. The Beaufighters went in first. They came in at wave-top height, 40 feet above the ocean, in a line abreast 3 miles wide, 20 forward-firing guns per aircraft. The Japanese gunners on the destroyers saw them coming and, trained to expect torpedo bombers, trained to fear the low, flat run of a fairy swordfish or a Grumman Avenger, depressed their anti-aircraft barrels toward the waterline. Exactly as they had been trained, exactly as Pappy Gunn had gambled they would. Because as the Beaufighters closed and the anti-aircraft guns tracked down, Ed Larner's 12 B-25 Commerce destroyers were already diving in from 10,000 feet, aiming for the same ships at the same moment from a completely different angle. At 10:04 hours on the morning of March 3rd, Larner leveled off at 50 feet above the Bismarck Sea and put the transport Teo Maru in his gun sight. He opened fire at 800 yards. The next 12 minutes would become one of the most catastrophic naval losses ever inflicted from the air. Teo Maru's superstructure disintegrated. The bridge windows blew out. The captain died before he could give an order. The anti-aircraft crews died at their guns with their barrels still pointed at the sea. Larner released 2 bombs at 100 yards. Both skipped. Both hit. The second bomb rolled into the engine room. The ship broke in half. She sank in minutes. Most of the soldiers was below decks, packed shoulder to shoulder in the troop compartments, weighed down by their combat gear, never made it to the ladders. Behind Larner, the 11 other B-25s of the 90th Squadron were selecting their own targets. The transport Oigawa Maru was hit by 4 bombs in the same run. The transport Ayo Maru took 3 bombs and burned for an hour before rolling over. The transport Nojima was hit in her fuel bunkers. The explosion was later described by pilots 20 miles away as a mushroom cloud that reached 10,000 feet. But it was on the destroyer Shirayuki that the war changed. Rear Admiral Kimura was on the bridge when the first B-25 came in. He had been trying to coordinate the destroyer screen, giving orders through the voice tube to the engine room. He never finished the sentence. A .50 caliber round entered his left shoulder from the direction of the port bow. Another entered his abdomen. He fell to the deck of the bridge, one hand still gripping the binocular strap around his neck. Around him, his bridge crew died standing. A skip bomb rolled into Shirayuki's aft magazine. The magazine detonated. The entire stern of the ship, 120 feet of steel plating, and 32 men, was severed from the hull and sank into the Bismarck Sea in less than 30 seconds. The destroyer Shikinami came alongside the crippled flagship. A crew pulled Kimura and the surviving officers off the sinking wreck of Shirayuki and carried them below decks to the medical bay. Kimura was still conscious. He was bleeding from 2 bullet wounds. He asked, in a quiet voice, how many transports were still afloat. The answer he received was, none. Shirayuki sank at 07 degrees 15 minutes south, 148 degrees 30 minutes east, 55 nautical miles southeast of Finschhafen. She took her name with her, White Snow. By the time Kimura was carried onto Shikinami's medical table, 3 more destroyers of his squadron were already dying. Arashio was hit by 3 bombs, lost her steering, and rammed the burning transport Nojima. Both ships sank together. Tokitsukaze took a bomb in her engineering spaces and drifted dead in the water. Lieutenant General Adachi and most of her crew were transferred to Yukikaze, the destroyer carrying Nakano, before Tokitsukaze went under. 2 Japanese generals, 1 destroyer. Asashio would sink the next morning, strafed by A-20s, while she was stopped in the water, attempting to pick up men swimming in the sea. In 12 minutes, 12 B-25s built by a man with no engineering degree, using guns pulled from the wreckage of dead fighters, had done what an entire fleet of high-altitude bombers had failed to do in 7 months. They had sunk a Japanese convoy. All of it. What happened on March 4, 1943, does not appear in most American history books. It happened anyway. The convoy had been broken. The transports were gone. The destroyers that could still steam were retreating toward Rabaul with as many survivors as they could carry, approximately 2,700 men, packed onto the decks of Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo. 2 Japanese submarines, I-17 and I-26, had been dispatched to pick up more survivors from the water. But hundreds of Japanese soldiers were still in the sea. They had jumped from burning transports the day before. They were clinging to floating debris. They were holding onto rafts, onto planks, onto the bodies of their dead comrades. Some had been in the water for more than 20 hours. At approximately 7 o'clock on the morning of March 4th, the 5th Air Force returned. Not to attack the destroyers, to attack the men in the water. A-20 Havocs, B-25 Mitchells, and Australian Beaufighters strafed the survivors of the convoy for the better part of 2 hours. They strafed lifeboats. They strafed rafts. They strafed men swimming. General Kenny addressed the decision in his memoirs many years later. He wrote, and the words are still there, in his own hand, in the archives, that he had given the order deliberately and that he did not regret it. His reasoning was recorded in one sentence. If 6,000 Japanese soldiers had reached Lae, we would have had to fight them in the jungles of New Guinea. We would have lost twice that number of Americans, killing them in the jungle. So we killed them in the water. The final count from the Bismarck Sea, when it was tallied at the end of March 4th, was this: 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk. 15 Japanese fighter aircraft destroyed, 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors dead, Allied losses, 2 bombers, 4 fighters, 13 airmen. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, wounded and semi-conscious in the medical bay of the destroyer Shikinami, was carried back to Rabaul. His flagship was gone. His convoy was gone. Half the men he had promised to deliver to Leh were dead. His war was not over. The Imperial Navy, in a decision that surprised almost everyone who understood how the Imperial Navy usually treated failed commanders, did not disgrace him. They did not remove him from duty. They gave him another command. They gave him another chance. And what Kimura would do with that second chance, 4 months later, in the freezing fog of the North Pacific, would become one of the most remarkable command decisions of the entire Second World War. But that comes later. For now, on the evening of March 4th, 1943, a 43-year-old aircraft mechanic named Paul Gunn stood in the operations tent at Port Moresby, looking at the tally sheet from that morning's mission. He did not smile. He was thinking about a rubber stamp in Ohio. He was thinking about his wife. Paul Gunn did not want to leave the Pacific. Manila was closer than it had been in 14 months. American forces had taken Guadalcanal. New Guinea was turning. Every mission Pappy flew brought him one small step closer to the barbed wire fence at Santo Tomas University, where his wife and 4 children were still counting the days. He had lost 40 pounds. His hair had turned completely grey. He was 43 years old, and he was fighting a war whose only real objective, in his own mind, was to walk through the gates of a Japanese prison camp and find his family alive. On March 27, 1943, 23 days after the Bismarck Sea, General Kenny ordered him to Long Beach, California. Pappy argued. He pleaded. He pointed out that every day he spent in California was a day his wife would spend without medicine. Kenny gave him 6 weeks and put him on a transport plane the next morning. The North American aviation plant at Long Beach covered 140 acres of Southern California hardpan, 20,000 workers on 3 shifts. It was the most efficient bomber factory in the world. Pappy Gunn walked into it carrying 11 pages of pencil drawings. The engineers who greeted him were the same engineers who 7 weeks earlier had stamped his modifications impractical. Pappy did not care. He walked into the conference room, put his pencil drawings on the table, and answered every question the same way. I have flown it. It flies. Look at Bismarck. The engineers asked for stress calculations. Pappy said he did not have any. The engineers asked for wind tunnel data. Pappy said he did not have any. The engineers asked about the muzzle blast, peeling the aluminum skin around the cheek gun mounts. Pappy pulled a wax pencil from his flight jacket and drew, on the polished mahogany conference table, the extended blast tubes he had welded onto the muzzles of every gun to project the pressure wave beyond the fuselage skin. Problem solved. In pencil, on the table. Over the next 2 weeks, the engineers stopped fighting. Jack Fox, the man who had first shipped Pappy's drawings back to Long Beach 9 months earlier, without permission, on his own signature, was in that conference room. He translated. Where Pappy said, I welded a plate here, Fox said reinforce with 6-gauge aluminum stock at frame station 27.5. Where Pappy said the airplane wanted to nose over, so I moved the batteries back. Fox said corrected center of gravity shift by relocating electrical system components aft of the wing spar. The pencil drawings became blueprints. The blueprints became production orders. The first factory built B-25G with a solid armored nose and 450 caliber machine guns and a 75mm cannon mounted along the fuselage centerline rolled off the Long Beach assembly line on May 10, 1943. 400 of them were built. Then North American improved the design. Pappy tested the 75mm cannon in combat and reported that it was slow and inaccurate, one round every 30 seconds manually reloaded by the navigator, and most Pacific crews were already ripping it out and replacing it with more machine guns. So the factory added more machine guns. The B-25J, the final variant, carried 18 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. 4,318 of them were built. It was the most heavily armed medium bomber in the history of aerial warfare. Every one of them descended in a straight and unbroken line from 11 pages of pencil drawings that the engineers at Wright Field had officially declared impossible. Pappy Gunn was on a transport plane back to Australia by the middle of May. He had been gone exactly 6 weeks. His family was still in Manila. On the other side of the world, in a naval hospital at Rabaul, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura was learning to walk again. The bullet in his shoulder had come out cleanly. The one in his abdomen had done more damage. It had missed his spine by less than an inch. The Imperial Navy, to the surprise of many of Kimura's contemporaries, did not disgrace him. By the standards of Japanese naval culture in 1943, this was extraordinary, but someone in Tokyo. The historical record has never made clear exactly who decided that Kimura had done what could be done, that the fault at Bismarck was not the admirals, but the plans. In July of 1943, they gave him another mission. They told him to sail into the Aleutian Islands, into the freezing fog of the North Pacific, into a bay ringed by American cruisers and destroyers and long-range patrol bombers, and to bring home the 5,183 Japanese soldiers who were still holding the island of Kiska. The Americans had been waiting for the Japanese to try. They had assembled the largest surface fleet in the North Pacific to prevent it. They had submarines in the approaches. They had B-24 Liberators patrolling the fog banks. They had ordered the invasion of Kiska for August, and they had told their commanders that any Japanese evacuation attempt would result in the annihilation of the evacuation force. Rear Admiral Kimura sailed anyway. He waited for the weather. He waited 3 weeks. He waited until the fog closed over the North Pacific like a lid. And then, on July 29, 1943, in visibility so thick his lookouts could not see the bow of their own ship. From the stern, Kimura took a squadron of light cruisers and destroyers into Kiska Harbor. He took every man off the island. 5,183 soldiers in 55 minutes. He turned around. He sailed out. The American fleet, sitting less than 100 miles away, never saw him, never heard him, never knew he had been there. When the American invasion force landed on Kiska 2 weeks later, they found empty barracks, half-eaten meals, and dogs still tied up outside the mess halls. The Japanese Empire had vanished from the North Pacific in a single night. The man who had lost 6,000 men in the Bismarck Sea had saved 5,000 in the Aleutians. Kimura was promoted to vice admiral. He served the rest of the war in staff positions. He was never again given a combat command. He did not seek one. He survived the war. He was never tried for war crimes. He returned to civilian life in a defeated Japan and lived quietly. He wrote no memoirs. He gave no interviews. He died in Chiba Prefecture on February 14, 1960, at the age of 68. He is buried in Tottori, the prefecture that had adopted him at birth. The Americans he had fought at Bismarck did not know he was dead until years later. The other men on that convoy were not so fortunate. Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commander of the 51st Division, survived the Bismarck Sea aboard Yukikaze and reached New Guinea by other means. He commanded what was left of his division through the retreat up the Huon Peninsula. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the entire 18th Army, survived aboard Yukikaze as well. He led the remnants of his forces in New Guinea for the next 2.5 years, watching his men starve and die of disease and be hunted through the jungle by the Australian Army. When Japan surrendered in September of 1945, he had 13,000 men left of the 65,000 he had started with. He surrendered his sword to the Australian 6th Division at Cape Wom. The Australians charged him with war crimes for the actions of his subordinates. Adachi did not defend himself. He said, in open court, that command responsibility was absolute. On July 12, 1947, an Australian military tribunal sentenced him to life imprisonment. On September 10, 1947, in his quarters at the prisoners' compound at Rabaul, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi used a paring knife to open his own abdomen. He was 57 years old. He left several letters. One of them was addressed to the officers and men of the 18th Army who were still imprisoned with him. In it, he wrote that he could not bear the thought of return to Japan alive, while so many of the men who had served under him lay in the ground of New Guinea. He was buried in the same ground. On October 20, 1944, American forces landed at Leyte in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore in front of the newsreel cameras and said the words he had promised. Paul Gunn was in the air over the beachhead. He was flying a B-25 Mitchell modified with 14 forward-firing guns. 5 weeks later, on the morning of November 27, 1944, Japanese aircraft attacked Tacloban airfield on Leyte in a low-level surprise raid. Among the ordnance they dropped were incendiary bombs loaded with white phosphorus. Pappy Gunn was caught out in the open. A fragment of a phosphorus bomb, a jagged shard of casing, and the burning white paste that clung to it struck him in the upper left arm and shoulder. Phosphorus does not stop burning when it hits flesh. It keeps burning. It has to be dug out. The wound rendered his left arm useless. The pain would follow him for the rest of his life. The surgeon at the field hospital at Leyte told him what he already knew. His combat career was over. The wound qualified him for immediate medical retirement. He was 45 years old. He had served 26 years between the Navy and the Army. He was evacuated to a hospital in Australia. He would remain in convalescence until the end of the war. 10 weeks later, on the morning of February 3, 1945, the American 1st Cavalry Division broke through the outer defenses of Manila and drove directly to the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp. 3,700 Allied prisoners were inside. Pappy Gunn weighed 89 pounds. His daughter Julie weighed 63. They had been eating rice and vegetable soup once a day for the past year. His son Nathaniel had watched over his mother and sisters through 3 years of hunger and disease. His daughter Julie had spent months in a full-body cast from an illness she had contracted in the camp. They were alive. MacArthur himself visited the camp 2 weeks after liberation. He arranged for the Gunn family to be flown out to Australia. Polly and the children walked into the hospital ward in Brisbane on a spring afternoon in 1945. Pappy was in bed. His left arm was in a sling. He had lost 40 pounds since the last time Polly had seen him. His hair had gone completely white. His face was the face of a man 10 years older than the man she had married. She did not recognize him at first. Then he said her name, and she knew him. Paul Irvin Gunn retired from the United States Army Air Force as a full colonel on June 30, 1948. Medical disability. He was 48 years old. General MacArthur had recommended him for promotion to brigadier general in a classified letter dated July of 1945. The recommendation was denied. The army was demobilizing. There were no stars available. Pappy did not complain. He went back to Manila. He rebuilt Philippine Airlines from 3 war-surplus C-47 transports. By 1956, the airline he had started with 5 Beechcraft in 1938 was flying to San Francisco. On October 11, 1957, 1 week before his 58th birthday, Pappy Gunn chartered a Beechcraft Model 18 twin-engine plane to fly from Manila to Baguio, a routine trip 140 miles over the Cordillera Mountains. A thunderstorm closed in faster than the weather service had predicted. The Beechcraft's radio went silent. Search and rescue teams found the wreckage 3 days later on the side of a mountain ridge. The airplane had flown into the storm cell. The pilots had tried to climb above it. The winds had driven them into the ridge. Paul Gunn was killed instantly. His body was returned to the United States and buried at Barrancas National Cemetery on Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida. The base where he had spent much of his naval career, the base where he had first learned engines with his hands, in the dark 40 years earlier. 9 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster, 9 Air Medals. The Distinguished Service Cross had been recommended for him and never approved. The grave marker is small. It gives his name and his rank and his dates. It does not, in the small space provided, explain what he had actually done. In the years after the war, the United States Air Force codified everything he had built into official tactical doctrine, concentrated forward gunfire to suppress point defenses, low-altitude approaches to overwhelm layered air defense, coordinated multi-altitude strike packages. None of the doctrine documents mention Paul Gunn by name. His name does not appear in the official histories. The AC-130 Spectre gunship, first deployed to Vietnam in 1968, was a direct descendant of his B-25 modifications. The A-10 Warthog, first flown in 1972, was a direct descendant of his A-20 modifications. Every modern American attack aircraft with forward-firing guns owes its existence to a set of pencil drawings that the U.S. Army Air Force had officially declared impossible on March 1, 1943. 2 days before, those drawings, in physical form, killed a Japanese admiral's fleet in the Bismarck Sea. Rear Admiral Kimura, in the medical bay of Shikinami, dying and not dying, had asked one question when they told him what had hit his convoy. What kind of airplanes were those? The answer, if anyone had been able to give it to him, would have been this. They were the airplanes that officially did not exist. They were built by a man whose wife was in a prison camp 400 miles from where you are lying right now. He built them because he had nothing left to lose, and because the engineers who told him it could not be done had never watched their families walk through a barbed wire gate and disappear. He built them out of grief, and they sank your fleet in 12 minutes. Paul Irvin Gunn's grave in Pensacola is not famous. Most of the pilots who fly over it on their way to touch down at Nass, Pensacola, do not know he is there. His son Nathaniel wrote a book about him in 1994. It sold 12,000 copies. It is out of print. The B-25 that carried his design is in a museum in Fredericksburg, Texas. There is a small card next to it that describes his modifications. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. He would not have minded. He had not fought the war for a card in a museum. He had fought it for one afternoon in a hospital ward in Brisbane. In the spring of 1945, when his wife looked up from the doorway and, after 3 years and 1 month and 11 days of not knowing whether she would ever see him again, finally recognized his face. That was what he had built the airplanes for. Everything else was just